And we're framing 4:3, the inner one.
You are,
16
in
by
case it goes that way.
right. Why don't you give me the tight shot too, just so I can tell you where I want to be on the tight shot. Keep going. It's this one here, and then the side one's over here. I think it's on one.
Okay.
Why don't you push in right about there?
That'll be the tight.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Let's go back out. Okay. Good.
Does that work for you?
Yeah, it's fine. If you want to go a little bit wider, just trim with that
Just
lamp.
the other lamp, yeah.
Okay, great, right there.
Okay.
All right, we're rolling, right?
Yep.
All right, Dan. What? I know it's Dan. Why don't you give me how you want your name to super on screen? Daniel Gumbleton or Dan
Just Dan.
Dan.
Dan Gumbleton, yeah.
Okay, and then brother. You're younger. How many years younger?
4 years.
4 years.
I'm the youngest in the family.
And just so I have it on tape, do we have your permission to use your comments for this tape?
Oh, absolutely.
If you could just say that they won't hear my questions.
I know.
So at least
That's all right.
I whatever. I give
You have
my
permission for whatever you need to do
okay,
here.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I sign off all releases.
Okay, great. We'll give you $1.
Oh no, you don't have to do that.
All right, Dan.
Tony, you can't do any hand movement, just so you know.
Okay, I'll keep my hand down here. Hit me if I do it. You know? Back up to here as it's here. Okay. Well, Dan, just to start out, so what was it like growing up with Tom? I mean, do you have any specific memories or?
Well, Tom was a very private fellow when we were kids, and he was the example of the studious brother. And so being the youngest in the family, we all had to live up to Tom as the model. The three of us who were younger had to live up to his excellence of being a student. So Tom would go to school. He stayed at school.
Okay, I'll keep my hand down here. Hit me if I do it. You know? Back up to here as it's here. Okay. Well, Dan, just to start out, so what was it like growing up with Tom? I mean, do you have any specific memories or?
Well, Tom was a very private fellow when we were kids, and he was the example of the studious brother. And so being the youngest in the family, we all had to live up to Tom as the model. The three of us who were younger had to live up to his excellence of being a student. So Tom would go to school. He stayed at school, played sports, came home, had dinner, and then studied. And so that was his life, as I remember it. I was a little too young to remember him in grade school. But certainly when he was in high school and I was still in grade school, I remember how well he was a student. And I wasn't, unfortunately, as good.
So it sounds like everybody just hated Tom then, because he set such an example.
Well, I guess, being the youngest of 9, I hated them all because they were all such good students. I really was ultimately, but it was kind of fun.
What, having grown up with Tom, do you still see him as just your brother or as something else?
Yes, I see him as my brother, but I also see him as the most spiritual person I've ever known. And that's something I'm very happy about, because he's the person who gives me and even my children and grandchildren that sense of what it means to be a spiritual person. And that, to me, is very significant about him. He's such a calm, loving, and very spiritual. And that is what I think is important, as being just his brother.
When you think of Tom, I've heard descriptions of Tom being very competitive.
Oh, yes. Tom is extremely competitive. When he played hockey, he was the best checker on the team, and everybody better watch out. I remember one time playing tennis with he and my sister Irene, and he was very competitive, and it was very hard. He was a big challenge no matter what sport. He was good at it, and I remember going to see many basketball games where Tom was the aggressive basketball player at Sacred Heart. And he is aggressive.
Do you think that translates into what he does nowadays? Do you think that's what kind of gives him a drive or something? Or?
Well, I don't know if it's that, but I remember many years ago he was at a meeting, and Tom was very quiet and sat back, and I forget exactly what the occasion was, but it was something that people were arguing about one side or the other, and Tom sat there very quietly, and he spoke so quiet, everybody had to stop and listen so that he made his point. So he didn't come across with the aggressive bully mannerism that you would think an aggressive sportsman would do. But he was very subtle with his approach in situations like that.
Yeah, that's a good point about Tom. I think a lot of people who don't know him or think they know what Tom is like think he's just out to grab headlines and to make a name for himself. And I think anybody who knows Tom knows that's not the case at all.
That surprises me because I've never thought of Tom as grabbing headlines, and sometimes on some of his issues, I keep thinking, why isn't he getting more national press on this? We don't hear much about him in California. And I think, there are other people out there, religious figures, who happen to be everywhere that something's happening, and that's not Tom. And so I think he's very, very subtle in how he is, and I've never thought of him as pursuing the press.
I agree. It's more they come to him and or what his actions kind of trigger something.
That's right. And his actions, his positions, the press comes to him. And I don't know that he has ever sought the press out. He may have, but not in a really public sort of way.
Um, what now? Just to go into more what Tom does. What do you see Tom doing with his life?
At this point, that's hard to say because I think Tom has devoted his life to his mission as a priest. He's devoted his life to the people he has served. I think it's going to be very hard for Tom to not have the parish to use as a means of working with people. And he's going to have to, like all of us when we retire, figure out how to use all of what we have and to use it in a new way. I think Tom will continue with his world peace movement. I think he will continue with his support of the gay and lesbian community. He's been very forceful there. I think he will be still a public speaker on those kind of issues. He's not going to let that go.
Well, and not a lot has been talked about yet, but has Tom talked to you guys about is he being forced to retire or is he, how's he?
Well, I think his parish bulletin last Sunday indicated rather clearly that with the new organization of the parishes, that at his age he's retired. The Pope required him to retire at 75, which he kind of pushed off to 76. And I think it's just part of that process.
Well, that's part of the process, but there's a lot of people who think Tom is being punished for his, actually his latest role in Cleveland, what's your personal opinion on that?
That's hard to say. I have my own feelings that, and I'm kind of angry about it because I do think that he has spoken out from a very personal place, and we were all as a family just shocked. I cried very hard when I heard. And I think he said the right things. And, he's lived with a horrible memory for 60 years, and he understands this issue better than anyone. And it was really painful to know that, and then to hear some of the people and to read some of the press. I have a huge file at home, and how he was criticized. And I just felt that was really wrong. It was so un-Christian-like to criticize the victim. And having been in the field of social work for a good number of years, I have seen so many people who have been injured become the victim because they spoke out. and I do think that's happened with Tom. Whether he's being punished, that's a hard judgment to make, but I certainly think there is an unspoken desire that he would pack up and retire and go away, because he's been too much of a voice for too many things.
Let's go to that tighter shot now. You're obviously quite emotional about it. I could tell, that you were, it really has bothered you the way they're treating Tom.
Yes.
And, I think a lot of people feel that, maybe not the word punished, but, something that they're, and Tom in his last few homilies has talked about, how a prophet isn't, accepted in his own time. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Well, as I listened to Tom last Sunday at Mass, I went, "You're talking about yourself." And I think he probably would agree that he was, but he would never openly criticize or challenge the authority of the Archbishop.
Let's back up, because they didn't hear my question. Can you talk about the prophet not being, because they won't hear my part of that question. So right now,
Oh, I
what
gotcha.
we're talking about.
Right.
So Tom is, in his homily, kind of talked about prophets not being accepted. Can you work that into the questions?
Okay. When we were at Mass last Sunday, and in his homily, Tom spoke a lot about some of the failures of the church over the history, the recent history, and he also talked about the prophets, the people who spoke out, were rejected and were not listened to. There were many who spoke out against the Holocaust, and they were not listened to. And he spoke about how the government and the church has become a bureaucracy that doesn't listen. They have their own agenda, and it may not include the issues that are current today. And I thought it was so interesting how he's commented that at the recent bishops' conference, the biggest issue they could talk about was whether we say the words this way or that way. And I thought, well, for goodness sakes, we have a war going on in this world. We have prejudice. We have discrimination. We have poverty. He's feeding hundreds of people. And they don't want to talk about those things. And I found that is part of his being the prophet. He wants to talk about those things. And the church doesn't. And the church does not want to do that. So I do think when he said there were prophets who were rejected, and I think his voice has been rejected by the church, simply because when he spoke in Ohio about the extension of the statute of limitations, when they accused him of somehow being at fault. And without quite saying that, but the papers made it really clear that the church was unhappy with him for doing that. So, but again, he was talking about the need for justice and healing to people, and that we as a society need to be open to the process of justice for people who were victims of sexual abuse.
Let me just have you blot around your eye. I think you're getting a little shiny here.
Okay.
All right. Well, now, Tom, these are specific questions for you now, Dan. Tom's, learned a lot and changed kind of because of you. And, can you talk about that? Let's go back how many years or whatever.
Well, my life took a real change. Well, I can't remember how long ago it was, but after I moved from Michigan to California, I realized that it was time for me to deal with my own sexual orientation. And I wrote my family and advised them that my marriage was over and that I, in fact, was a gay male. And that was very troubling for my mother. And Tom used to stop in at night to have a bite of supper at 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening, and so Mother was always prepared. And one night as he was leaving, Mother said, Tom, is Dan going to go to hell? And Tom said he looked at her and he said, why would you ask that question? God made Dan what he is. And no, Dan's not going to go to hell because he's gay. And Tom had done a lot of soul searching at that point. He had an experience within the year prior to that where one of the writers, reporters for the Michigan Catholic, wrote a couple of articles about coming out and being a gay person, and it was Tom's given responsibility to let him go. And that was very painful for Tom. And Tom, I'm sure, had not thought about this issue until these two incidents happened. And Tom has since then become a great spokesperson for acceptance of gays within the church. And he and I were in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, where the New Ways Ministries gave him an award for his work with the gay and lesbian community. He's been a major speaker for the Parents and Friends of Gays and Lesbians. So he's been very active in that movement. And he did an audio tape titled My Brother Dan, which was a very fascinating thing that New Ways promoted. So he's done a lot of homework on, and he knows how to present this, that and how to say that the current hierarchy is really wrong in their understanding not only of homosexuality but just sexuality in general. And that he said it's time that they started to look at what this is all about. One time Tom told me that he said, what I want to do is to make every bishop in this country discover that they have a gay relative. And he said, we stopped talking about divorce when the bishops discovered they all had siblings who were getting divorced. And that ended that whole discussion, and that whole issue has gone away. And so he said that was his approach to help the bishops understand that it was perfectly normal to be gay, and that was God's intention. So he said once they discover that, how could they say this about their family? But unfortunately, some of them still do.
Let's wait for this drain to hear. It's well, that's a very good point about the bishops and divorce. I'd never heard that point made before, and I'm really glad you made that, because that it's stuff like that that's why I need to talk to all these different people, because it's comments like that. And I could find a better word, but when I interviewed Tom, he talked about how your coming out really forced him to reevaluate things that he thought about. So do you kind of feel in a way that you maybe changed Tom's destiny a little bit, or something? And I hate to use the word destiny, but you know what I mean? Do you feel like you were an influence on Tom's life for the better?
Absolutely. I think, I have had an enormous impact for thousands of people that I've never met, only because I did come out to my family. I could not live with that lie, that double life sort of thing. And for my own mental health, I had to do this. And I risked, and I did this, and Tom thought, and he realized what was really the natural phenomena. And with his changing his own understanding, because after all, as you grow up a Catholic, you just accept what is taught to you. And, he had to think through a lot of things. There was an enormous change in Tom's philosophy and understanding of spirituality after Vatican II. And when he came home from Rome for his studies there, Tom was a much more liberal sort of person than he was when he went over there. So Tom discovered that through John the 23rd, that it was good to challenge what you thought and what you were taught. And so I think Tom, did accept that challenge from me. And then as a result, particularly like with that audio tape about the two of us, and we appeared on National Public Radio together. And so I know that my courage to do and to risk the loss of my family, because at that point in history, this was back in the early 70s, where the gay community had not been well formed yet. And so there were a lot of people, and having been a therapist, I knew several that their families had thrown them out and would no longer deal with them. So I think, I feel like I've had a major influence on Tom, and that the two of us have done a lot of unknown good for a lot of people.
If you can make this into a complete thought, but how long were you married, and how many kids do you have, and grandkids? Now, just so people realize that,
Yeah. I was married for 15 years. I had I still have 4 wonderful daughters, 7 grandchildren, and my grandchildren have never known their grandfather without Carl, my partner of 23 years. And so my siblings all said at that time, well, what else is new, when I told them. So Carl and I have been very fortunate. We both have very loving families, that we're just together as a couple. Last Sunday at Mass, Tom was there, and there was a group of people, and he introduced Carl as his brother-in-law. And we both went, wow, that was neat, because in the state of California, we are considered each other's spouse. So we don't have marriage yet, but we have most of the legal rights that we want and need. But it was really interesting how he dealt with that. And he's just part of Carl's just part of this family.
as it should be. Now, Tom said something, and Tom is he's at the time when you came out. One of the things Tom said, he was upset because here I'm a bishop and my brother says he's gay. At the time, what was it like for you having a bishop as a brother, and wanting to come out? Did that make it harder or not, or did that not even factor into it?
I don't think the fact that Tom was a bishop made one bit of difference. I think it would have been more difficult had my dad been alive. My dad had passed away a few years before I came out, and I never thought about Tom as any different than my other brothers and Irene, my sister. I just felt, it was important for them to know who I was, and it was up to them to have to deal with it. I never thought about Tom as the bishop. When we did the interview for National Public Radio, the interviewer said, and this really kind of threw me, said, Bishop Gumbleton, how do you feel about the fact that here you're sitting with your brother and you're at the bishop's conference and you know your brother doesn't go to church anymore? And then she said, well, we'll take a break. And as, reporters do, and I've had my experience with reporters, they will not talk about that question during the so-called breaks. So she put the mic back on, and she repeated her question, and Tom said, well, he said, I'm very disappointed. I went, oops. And he said, but not in Dan. I'm disappointed in the church that they cannot understand the love that Dan shares and the beauty of the gay love. And so I again got all choked up, felt pretty darn proud. So I think that's some of the good that he's done with this.
Great. What would you want others to know about your family and Tom, or Tom in general?
I think our family is all very proud of Tom. We don't put him on any pedestal, although Mother liked to, as any mother of a priest did in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And Mother was so proud of Tom when he went to Tehran during the hostage crises. And that was all very exciting to see him on the nightly news and that program that came on late in the evening. Um, it was very exciting to see him as the representative to those folks that were in the embassy in Tehran. Um, but, we're proud of him, but we've always had him just as our brother. And we treat each other just as brothers. And I kind of shocked him a bit after this came out about his experience of being inappropriately touched. Um, I said to him, I said, I don't know what I'm going to do if you're not at St. Leo's, because that's the only church that I belong to. And he kind of looked and said, oh, really? And I said, well, St. Leo's has been the family parish now for a good number of years since he's been there. So this is going to be a loss to us. All my grandchildren are baptized at St. Leo's. They were actually baptized in my daughter's home, one of my daughter's homes, but no parish in Los Angeles, Riverside County, would let him baptize the kids at the church. So Tom baptized. We had the ceremony at home, and he registered the baptisms at St. Leo's, which I think is kind of neat. We'll do it one way or the other.
That's, and finally, kind of towards the end here, what would you want other people, maybe who watch this or something, watch this program, to understand about Tom? What is Tom trying to accomplish with his life, or what is Tom accomplishing?
The one thing that all of us say together is that Tom lives the philosophy of Jesus, which is a wonderful philosophy. And I don't question that philosophy of life. I think it's a philosophy based on love and caring and doing for others. Most of us in the family have been in the service field. Several our siblings were teachers, and I was a social worker. But we've all been service-oriented, and Tom has been that guide for us. And his philosophy is really to preach and to talk about Jesus and the philosophy of love and caring. And if we all did that, how wonderful this world would be. And if we all could love each other for who we are and not make judgments. So I think that's Tom. I think Tom is to me, a very saintly person. I feel privileged to be his brother. But I think he's still just my brother.
Is there a question I didn't ask that you're like, Tony, I really wanted to talk about this, or you didn't ask me about Tom, or this is important that people know this, or, is there something that you want to add that we haven't covered?
The only other thing is that he's such a private person.
Okay, let's talk about that. The public persona of, people who don't know Tom, who just maybe read an article about him or see something in the newspaper, think, this guy just wants headlines, and he's just trying to make a name for himself. But what's Tom really like?
I think Tom is a very private person. He's always been private from the time we were kids. Tom had his friends. Tom is a very gregarious person. He's very outgoing. But what does he feel? I don't know. I know what he thinks. I know what he believes. But his own personal passions and his disappointments, and I don't know what he feels about the changes that have taken place in his life this year. After Mass last Sunday, I gave him a big hug and said, "Are you okay?" And that was the first time I ever asked him something like that. "Are you okay?" Meaning emotionally. And he said, "Yeah, I'm doing fine." But again, Tom's very private. He lives in a very private way. He lives in this little house behind the church. And even when Carl and I spent quite a bit of time last summer at his summer home up north that he and Irene inherited from my brother Jack, Tom was all, we spent a lot of time, but there was still a lot of privacy about himself. And Irena's somewhat that way. Maybe the whole family is. I may be the more open because I've had to be open about who I am. But again, it's part of the period that we all grew up in. And today we have this tell-all, and that's not Tom. He's very private. And now he would not seek, in my mind, publicity to make himself important. I just don't think that. I think he realized many, many years ago that his public life was not going to advance him in the church. And he just pursued his mission. But he never said anything. He never said a word about the fact that all his pals who were bishops were appointed to their own diocese, and he never was. He never said anything about that. And so that's the privacy that he has. He just doesn't talk about those feelings.
Yeah, it's funny. Rita Mary, Sister Rita Mary, is kind of almost personal assistant.
Oh, yeah.
She's out in the dark about everything, it seems. She finds stuff out through the bulletin. She finds out, I'll mention something. Oh, Tom didn't tell me that.
Oh, I know. Tom does not go around telling